Most people think losing belly fat is simple. Eat less, move more, wait, cut enough calories, and eventually the fat around your stomach disappears along with everything else. That's what almost every diet plan is built on. But when researchers actually scanned people's bodies before and after weight loss, they found something that flips that assumption on its head. The fat you can pinch is not the fat that's putting you at risk, and cutting calories alone barely touches the fat that matters most. Here's the problem with the just eat less approach. When you drop calories, your body doesn't lose fat evenly. It fights back. Metabolic rate slows down, hunger hormones spike, and a chunk of what you lose ends up being muscle instead of fat. Studies comparing diet-only groups to diet plus other interventions groups consistently find the same pattern. The scale moves, but the fat wrapped around your organs, the dangerous kind, barely budges unless something else is added to the equation. Calorie counting alone is treating the symptom, not the mechanism. And this is where most people get discouraged and quit. They do everything right for weeks. The scale creeps down a pound or two, and they assume nothing is working, when in reality, the specific fat that's driving their health risk hasn't moved much at all, because restriction alone was never going to be enough to reach it. So what's the real lever? It's not another restriction. It's addition. Specific foods and habits act on three biological pathways that directly control how your body stores and releases visceral fat independent of how many calories you're eating. Add the right inputs, and your body starts pulling fat from around your organs, even when the number on the scale barely moves. This is a dose-dependent response. The more consistently you apply these levers, the more your body responds. Let's talk about why this actually matters. Because visceral fat isn't just the fat you can see. It's the fat wrapped around your liver, pancreas, and intestines. And unlike the fat under your skin, it's metabolically active. It pumps out inflammatory chemicals and hormones around the clock. Doctors have linked elevated visceral fat to insulin resistance, high blood pressure, fatty liver disease, type 2 diabetes, heart disease, and through chronic inflammation, an increased risk of certain cancers and even cognitive decline later in life. This isn't a cosmetic issue. It's an organ health issue, and it's one your body is dealing with every single day, whether you notice it or not. Here's the part that surprises most people. Two people can weigh exactly the same and carry completely different amounts of visceral fat. Body weight alone doesn't tell you this story. Waist circumference is a far better proxy, and imaging like CT or MRI is the only way to actually measure it directly. That's part of why the just watch the scale mindset fails so many people. The number can look fine, while the risk underneath keeps climbing. So here's what's coming. We're going to walk through three biological mechanisms that control visceral fat storage, backed by real published research, not guesses, not trends. Then we'll cover the multiplier that makes all three of them work faster. Research on this multiplier alone has shown visceral fat reductions measured directly on CT and MRI scans without any change in diet at all. Quick word on where this comes from. This breakdown pulls from peer-reviewed studies out of institutions like Wake Forest Baptist Medical Center and Shahid Beheshti University of Medical Sciences, along with systematic reviews and meta-analyses published in journals like Obesity Reviews and Frontiers in Physiology. This video is for educational purposes and isn't a substitute for medical advice. If you have a health condition or take medication, talk to your doctor before making major changes to your diet or exercise routine. There are three mechanisms we're covering, and they each hit visceral fat from a different angle: inflammation, insulin resistance, and the stress hormone pathway that tells your body to store fat centrally in the first place. Let's start with the first one. Mechanism 1 is inflammation. Visceral fat doesn't just sit there, it behaves almost like an organ of its own, releasing inflammatory signaling molecules that create a low-grade, chronic inflammatory state throughout your body. That inflammation doesn't just come from visceral fat, it also feeds it, creating a loop where inflammation promotes more central fat storage. Breaking that loop is one of the fastest ways to change the trajectory. The clearest lever here is soluble fiber. Researchers at Wake Forest Baptist Medical Center followed over 1,100 adults for 5 years, using CT scans to directly measure visceral fat at the start and end of the study. What they found was striking. For every 10-gram increase in daily soluble fiber, participants accumulated 3.7% less visceral fat over that 5-year period. Soluble fiber slows digestion, feeds beneficial gut bacteria that produce anti-inflammatory compounds, and helps regulate blood sugar swings that otherwise spike inflammation. You'll find it concentrated in oats, apples, pears, beans, and lentils. 2 small apples, a cup of green peas, and half a cup of pinto beans gets you most of the way to that 10-gram target in a single day. If beans and oats aren't your thing, other solid sources include chia seeds, Brussels sprouts, and barley all deliver meaningful soluble fiber without needing a special shopping trip. The lead researcher on that Wake Forest study, Dr. Kristen Hairston, put it simply, visceral fat doesn't just sit there, it's an active part of your body and makes a lot of toxic substances that promote inflammation and insulin resistance. Which brings us to mechanism 2. Mechanism 2 is insulin resistance. When your cells stop responding properly to insulin, your body compensates by pumping out more of it, and elevated insulin is one of the strongest known signals for your body to store fat centrally, around your organs rather than elsewhere. This is a two-way street. Visceral fat worsens insulin resistance, and insulin resistance drives more visceral fat storage. It's a cycle. And breaking it requires something that acts directly on insulin sensitivity. This is where broccoli sprouts come in. They're one of the richest natural sources of a compound called sulforaphane, which activates a cellular pathway known as NRF2. Think of it as your body's internal antioxidant switch. In a randomized, double-blind clinical trial out of Shahid Beheshti University of Medical Sciences in Tehran, researchers gave broccoli sprout powder to people with type 2 diabetes and tracked their insulin resistance directly using a standard clinical measure called HOMA-IR. The result: participants showed measurably improved insulin sensitivity and lower fasting blood glucose compared to the placebo group. Broccoli sprouts are easy to grow at home in a jar on your kitchen counter in about 5 days. Or you can find them fresh at most health food stores and some regular grocery chains, if sprouts aren't accessible where you live. Other cruciferous vegetables, broccoli itself, cauliflower, kale, and cabbage, contain related compounds and offer a meaningful, if smaller, version of the same effect. The pattern holds across the research. Cruciferous vegetables consistently show up in studies tied to improved insulin markers. Mechanism 3 is the stress hormone pathway, and it's the one almost nobody talks about. Your body has a built-in fat storage signal, and it's called cortisol. When cortisol stays chronically elevated, which happens with poor sleep, not just stress in the traditional sense, your body preferentially stores fat viscerally instead of elsewhere. Researchers have shown that even a few nights of shortened sleep measurably shifts your hormone profile. Leptin, the hormone that signals fullness, drops, while ghrelin, the hormone that drives hunger, rises. Layer that on top of chronically elevated cortisol, and you get a body that's simultaneously hungrier and primed to store what it eats around your organs. The lever here isn't a food, it's consistency. Studies tracking sleep duration alongside abdominal fat and insulin resistance find the relationship holds even when diet and exercise are accounted for separately. Getting closer to 7 to 9 hours a night on a consistent schedule is one of the few interventions that directly targets this specific pathway. No supplement replaces this one, it's structural. Not something you can eat your way around. That's the food and lifestyle piece. 3 mechanisms. 3 real levers. Now here's the multiplier that makes all 3 work faster. Exercise. A systematic review and meta-analysis covering dozens of randomized controlled trials found that aerobic exercise alone without any dietary change reduced visceral fat by more than 30 square centimeters in women and more than 40 square centimeters in men, measured directly on CT scans over roughly 12 weeks. That's without cutting a single calorie. A separate 2024 network meta-analysis published in Obesity Reviews, covering 84 randomized controlled trials, confirmed that aerobic exercise, resistance training, combined training, and high-intensity interval training all significantly reduced visceral fat, with HIIT showing the strongest effect in several of the studies reviewed. Here's the myth bust. People quit because the scale doesn't move. But visceral fat can drop significantly while total body weight stays flat, especially early on, because you're often losing fat while maintaining or even gaining a small amount of muscle. If you're only weighing yourself, you're missing the actual story. So how do you actually apply this without overthinking it? You don't need to hit elite intensity. The talk test is the simplest heuristic. If you can talk but not sing during your workout, you're in the right aerobic zone. Public health guidelines generally point to around 150 minutes of moderate intensity activity per week as the threshold where visceral fat reduction reliably shows up in the research. That's roughly 30 minutes, 5 days a week. If you're starting from zero, don't jump straight to that. Ramp up gradually over 2 to 3 weeks. Start with brisk walking, add a flight of stairs, work up to a jog or a bike ride. 2 to 4 sessions a week of anything that gets your heart rate up and holds it there is enough to start seeing the mechanism work. You also don't need a gym membership or specialized equipment. A brisk 30-minute walk after dinner, taken consistently, checks the same physiological box as a structured cardio session for a beginner. The research doesn't reward intensity for its own sake, it rewards consistency over weeks and months. If you can only manage 10 minutes some days, that's still better than nothing, and it still counts toward the weekly total. One safety note: if you have a heart condition, are pregnant, or haven't exercised in a long time, check with a doctor before ramping up intensity. This content is educational, not a personalized medical program. So let's close the loop. Remember the opening. Most people think it's just calories in, calories out. But a 2011 study on 114 adults found the people who added soluble fiber and moderate activity to their routine without necessarily changing total calorie intake saw meaningfully less visceral fat accumulation over 5 years than those who didn't. Same rough calorie picture, different result, because the mechanism, not just the math, is what determines where your body stores fat. 3 levers: fiber to cool inflammation, cruciferous vegetables to improve insulin sensitivity, and consistent sleep to shut off the stress hormone signal, plus exercise as the multiplier that speeds all 3 up. That's the real protocol, and it's backed by scans, not guesses. If this helped you see visceral fat differently, stick around, there's a lot more where this came from. Take care of yourself, and I'll see you in the next one.